November 18th, 1978. Deep in the rainforest of northwestern Guyana, a place called Jonestown had gone completely silent. Not the silence of sleep or the silence of an empty clearing, but something far more terrible. The largest single loss of American civilian life before September 11th, 2001, had just occurred in a jungle compound most of the world had never heard of. And for decades, questions have lingered. How did this happen? How did over 900 people follow one man into oblivion? And was it really, as history first recorded it, a mass suicide? James Warren Jones was born on May 13, 1931, in Crete, Indiana, a small town so unremarkable it barely registered on a map. He grew up in poverty, raised largely by his mother after his father, a World War I veteran severely damaged by mustard gas exposure, became increasingly absent. From early childhood, neighbours and family members would later recall that Jim Jones was different. He was obsessed with religion, with death, with power. He conducted mock funerals for animals in his backyard. He preached to the other children with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. He was looking even then for followers. By his early 20s, Jones had found his calling. He began preaching in Indianapolis, and what set him apart from other ministers of his era was something genuinely radical for 1950s Indiana. He refused to segregate his congregation. The People's Temple ran drug rehabilitation programs, fed the homeless, cared for the elderly, found housing for the poor. Jim Jones seemed to be proof that faith and social justice could share the same pulpit. People were hungry for what he was offering: community, purpose, and a preacher who looked them in the eye and told them they mattered. Jones moved his congregation to California in the early 1960s, first to Ukiah, then to San Francisco and Los Angeles, where the People's Temple grew into a genuine political force. At its height, the church claimed tens of thousands of members. Politicians courted Jones. Former members who left the church in the mid-1970s began telling stories that were deeply disturbing. They described marathon church services that lasted well into the night, during which Jones would publicly humiliate members, accusing them of disloyalty and demanding confession. They described physical beatings administered in front of the congregation as discipline. They described a practice Jones called white nights, fake emergency drills, during which members were told the temple was under attack and that they might all need to die together, rather than be captured by their enemies. They described a man who had begun claiming to be divine, who told his congregation he could heal the sick and raise the dead, who staged fraudulent cancer cures using chicken livers and sleight of hand, who was consuming alarming quantities of prescription drugs. New West magazine was preparing to publish an expose based on these accounts in 1977. When Jones learned it was coming, he made a decision that would seal the fate of everyone around him. He relocated the majority of his congregation to a place they had already begun to build, a settlement in the jungle of Guyana, South America. The move to Jonestown was presented to members as the fulfillment of a dream, a socialist utopia carved out of the jungle, a community free from the racism and capitalism of American society. For many members, particularly older black Americans who had survived Jim Crow and were deeply skeptical of American institutions, the idea held genuine appeal. What they found was not utopia. Jonestown was a place of grinding labour, constant surveillance, inadequate food, tropical disease, and unrelenting psychological pressure. Jones broadcast his voice over loudspeakers throughout the compound at all hours, rambling, threatening, philosophizing. The white nights continued, becoming more frequent and more terrifying. Members were required to sign blank pieces of paper that Jones told them he would fill in with confessions of crimes. Back in the United States, the families of People's Temple members who could not get their loved ones out were organizing. A group called the Concerned Relatives compiled dossiers on conditions inside Jonestown and brought them to anyone in Washington who would listen. Among those who listened was a Democratic congressman from California named Leo Ryan. Ryan was known as a legislator who did not merely hold hearings. He investigated in person. He had once gone undercover in a California prison to document conditions from the inside. Ryan arrived in Guyana on November 14, 1978, accompanied by a delegation that included journalists, NBC cameraman Bob Brown, reporter Don Harris, San Francisco Examiner photographer Greg Robinson, and several family members hoping to bring their relatives home. Jim Jones was furious about the visit. He had no choice but to permit it. Refusing entry would have confirmed every accusation being made against him, but his paranoia, already extreme, was accelerating toward its breaking point. By November of 1978, Jones was deeply unwell, severely addicted to multiple drugs, his speech often slurred and rambling on the compound loudspeakers, speaking with increasing frequency about death as liberation, about revolutionary suicide as the ultimate act of defiance. The delegation entered Jonestown on November 17th. What they found was a community under enormous stress performing a desperate kind of normalcy. There was a welcome dinner. There was music. Jones gave an interview in which he was evasive and visibly deteriorating, but during the night, notes were slipped to members of Ryan's delegation by Jonestown residents begging to leave. By the following morning, a small group of defectors had come forward, 15 people who wanted to go home. As Ryan's delegation prepared to depart on November 18th with the defectors, the situation collapsed. A Jonestown resident named Don Sly, acting, investigators later concluded, on instructions, attacked Congressman Ryan with a knife. Ryan was not seriously injured, and the group made it to the nearby Port Kaituma airstrip. What happened there is documented in footage that Bob Brown kept recording, even as gunmen sent by Jones opened fire on the group. Leo Ryan was shot and killed, Don Harris was killed, Bob Brown was killed while still filming, Greg Robinson was killed, Patricia Parks, one of the defectors, was also killed, 9 others were wounded, and at Jonestown, the final white night had begun. Jim Jones assembled his congregation. An audio recording, recovered afterward and known as the death tape, captured what followed. Jones told his people that Ryan's murder meant that American forces would come and destroy the community. He told them it was time to die with dignity, rather than face what was coming. A large metal tub had been prepared, filled with a cyanide-laced flavoured drink. Syringes were used to administer it to infants and children who could not drink on their own. The death tape records people objecting. A woman named Christine Miller argued with Jones directly, telling him that there was something worth living for, that the Soviet Union, where Jones had been promising to relocate the community, was still an option. Jones dismissed her. Others can be heard weeping. Jones's voice grew more urgent, more insistent. He called the dying a revolutionary act. He told his people not to cry. "Stop this hysterics," he said. What the tape cannot tell us with certainty, what remains one of the most agonizing questions of the entire tragedy, is how many of the 918 people who died that day died willingly, and how many were coerced, forced, or simply had no real choice at all. Many were elderly, many were very young. Jim Jones died that afternoon of a gunshot wound to the head. It was ruled consistent with suicide, though it was also consistent with being shot by someone else. No one survived who witnessed his final moments. When Guyanese authorities and American military personnel entered Jonestown in the days that followed, they found a community that had been, in almost every material sense, real. There were gardens, there was a school, there was a nursery and a medical clinic, there were people's handmade belongings arranged in their small cabins, there were photographs of families and children's drawings, and the ordinary evidence of ordinary human lives. The people of Jonestown had not been monsters. They had been teachers and nurses and senior citizens and young parents and children who trusted the wrong man absolutely. The story of Jonestown is not the story of foolish people blindly following a madman. It is the story of idealistic people, many of them among the most marginalized in American society, who were offered something genuinely rare: community, dignity, purpose, belonging, by a man who understood exactly how to exploit those needs. 918 people died in the jungle on November 18, 1978. Most of them were black Americans who had believed in the promise of a better world. They deserved to be remembered, not as the punchline of a cultural reference, not merely as followers, not as footnotes, but as people, complex, hopeful, deceived, and gone. The silence that fell over Jonestown that afternoon has echoed for nearly 50 years. The least we can do is listen to what it is trying to tell us.